Hello everyone, today we talk about the traditional meaning of the Crusades. Naturally, we'll not overly discuss this in a single video with any satisfactory aim. It's also not the first video in which I discuss the Crusades, so much has already been said, but in perspective, comparison with all what should be said, of course we would never get to the end anyway. Today we interpole the traditional and the Crusade series to an important extent, because I must confess that even as a medievalist, I've never been particularly assaulted with Crusades historiography. The last years, thanks to Schwerpunkt, I managed to bridge a lot of gaps that really I needed to, the topic in and of itself is scholarly overly debated, and probably as sort of unsurprisingly in the wrong directions, and or at least without a more comprehensive, especially spiritual lens to that. Now, what stands out most strikingly about these campaigns is that warriors on opposing sides, Christian and Islamic alike, engage in fierce combat while experiencing and understanding their struggle according to one and the same profound spiritual meaning, right? This is valid actually for every people out there, and these are the things that I've always reiterated when making videos about Crusades. It's specifying that this where wars of religion is superfluous, right? And it mostly derives from actually an anti-Christian, an in any case, religious, mostly atheistic, leftistic idea that fundamentally was something allergen and or innovative, also in a deteriorative sense, for that matter, in the sense shocking, I don't know, for the businesses, whatever, about the Crusades, about the Pope launching these holy wars against the Muslims to recover the holy places. Nothing more false than this. The Crusades follow a pattern not just of universal warfare, meaning that every single people in the world at the time waged war in the name of God. Warfare had always and exclusively, like any other aspect of existence, being tied to divinity, and war in particular. I don't need to remind you, I don't know how many videos I have on this topic, from the Fortuna Kaiseris to other considerations of the generation of the concept of holy war, at least its dissolution in our later times, that witness to wars that are namely at least not much of religion anymore, but that basically still try to get a moral value from somewhere. And obviously, if your society is post-traditional versus anti-traditional, there can't be just very few that you can do to have a bit more of a spiritual, in this sense, also scientific compass in place. That's also why I'm making these videos. But even more in particular, there is a radical continuity from the ancient world and from the view of holy war as it had always been conceived in the West and elsewhere, given the exclusively transcendental nature of earthly powers. Was really seen in all the theologies involved, also starting from the Indo-European one for that matter, that definitely had a very strong impact, also in the same Christian information of holy war, right? You can argue that Christianity had been, and we've seen it in many videos, because this is basic sort of Christian, not just apologetics, but also sort of criticism, that Christians in any case had always backed the empire, right? There's not a moment in which it was claimed that the means of warfare per se would be fundamentally separated from other earthly actions that could entail even greater sins for that matter. The greater Christian apologism against the empire could be at most something like, since this polity is evil because it's ruled by evil people that are not Christian, then their wars are wrong, right? But aside from the overwhelming amount of Christian soldiery that existed since the very first century, if you even read the Gospels, you have the centurion converted to Christianity after his slave was healed. But there is a staunch, and in this sense also in the previous centuries, prevalent support of Roman warfare, political direction for the world, for the universe, because that was the only global power from a Christian perspective, from the side effect of the same Christians. Right. Essentially, I discovered, because you discovered these things as you make videos, that there is literally a part of the so-called adult population that believes that until the legalization of the Christian cult in the early 4th century, the late 3rd, the normal condition of Christians was being persecuted, massacred, or whatever. Christians normally lived in the Roman Empire, and there were very much ad personam, or also at most provincial provisions that even when called by emperors for the general direction of the empire, of course, did not administratively work as some sort of a massive pogrom of all Christians. Also because how could you even, determine easily how they were? Like, if you have any idea of Christian history, or Roman history for that matter, I have my points earned back in the day, that this sort of counterposition is completely nonsensical, and it fundamentally stems, also among traditionalists, very often from the notion that whatever is Christian is basically alien to whatever existed before. There was completely like a creation out of the blue that had no connection with anything, or that it was quote unquote copying from the previous religions, right? Without knowing that there was only one religion for everyone, and that tradition made it pretty much clear. And this is true also for that matter, as far as the Bible was concerned, and the same sort of previous religions. Then you could have different peoples devoting themselves through different figures to the ultimate divine power. This varies across the entire world because of culture, of their own sort of particular preservation of tradition and interpretation of the same. This is a completely different level, and it's a much lower one. The broader one is that historically, religion, millennia before Christ, had exclusively, absolutely, and unavoidably been Catholic, right? And if you do not know what Catholic means, again, it's not my problem at this point in the channel's history, because I overabundantly explained this in literally hundreds of videos, and even this one will work well as such, right? And this is an important statement also because when we look at Islam, we have to understand that there is not a club where, there is that people, there's the special one, and we should separate the entirety of the world from it because it's useless, because it's not your own, right? As a matter of fact, you will never understand your own until you understand the world, because that's literally what they believed at the time. And they believed that because, of course, they believed to be superior within a ecumenic theater, and it was not a provincialistic and sort of isolationistic inferiorism of the populistic kind that the Fourth Estate and other lesser people display today, right? It has absolutely nothing to do with that. That's overwhelmingly and overbearingly prevalent in neo-paganistic communities that should be embarrassed, by the way, if they care anything about pre-Christian cultures, even to use that name for that matter. There are also people who understand this, but the rigid separation and categorization of different attitudes in this sense is incredibly misleading, and it basically derives from the denial of difference as the fundamental measure of whether you are a superior or inferior being. So you can never treat the history of the Crusades, of course, also if you don't know the history of the Islamic world or others, which you shouldn't necessarily do more or less than that. Of course, nobody can be expert about everything, right? I personally know overwhelmingly much more about the West, but it doesn't make any sense, even in strategic analysis, as we've seen in von Clausewitz, to study this or that people, exactly to determine who was better and who was worse, because, interestingly enough, also the liberal-leaning side of the aisle would like to make you say that, no, they were basically the same, and or it was, it was money, man, it was not really religion, they were kind of fake, and, the average person did not really care, man, because, people are never, of course, responsible for their own government or what they get themselves involved in, and it would like to make you believe that they were morally equivalent, or that maybe, it was actually those damn Christians that were the bad ones, because look, today, the bigots are the Christians. And yeah, of course, because by the way, comparatively, Muslims are, such enlightened communities in today's world. In any case, we always speak by average because that's reality, and people don't like it. It's really their problem for that matter. There's also a strictly military side of the story that, of course, today will, because it's actually a history of religion video, right? But obviously it's baked into that, and we should sort of speak of that. Just yesterday we were talking about the Spanish military orders, and we're pointing out how, for example, that particular theater informed the Iberian knightly monastic orders in particularly peculiar ways, even though, again, the universal struggle was the same, and God in the higher nature is only one. It's just people getting wrong about different part of that, and that's the actual difference. But the unity of that is the foundation of any transcendental capacity that is exactly what all these actors were seeking. And it is true that throughout history and throughout all history, these concepts deteriorate. So wars are increasingly sort of fought for sort of the worst reasons, you could argue. War, however, has an inherent structure, metaphysical in nature, that is, in my opinion, in this sense, also truly understood by von Clausewitz, that never talks religion, but does not mean that it wasn't coming from there, and that, in fact, brings you, in any case, to fight it, always according to the same laws, right? It's just like war never changes, it's humanity that does, right? And that's why you have different wars all the time. If you don't know how to fight one, we have pretty obvious recent examples, that is just like the measure of how inferior of a civilization you actually are, all right? And that is extremely important because there are some culturalists that are people who basically taught von Clausewitz without even having ever opened the von Kriege, would like to make you believe that war is sort of a barbarian business where it's civilizations that actually are more successful at it, in case you haven't realized that. And actually at least the destructive potential of civilization is much higher than the one of savages, and an appropriate use of violence is proper of the higher power, as by deterrence that wouldn't even require to unseat the sword that is always there. And these are deeply, again, foundational concepts throughout the entire Roman past, pre-Christian times, as well as Christian times as well. Continuum is the key here. They were keeping to believe the same identical thing. We'll come back to that. There is a red thread connecting, Arjuna with the Templars, as a matter of fact. So the Crusades disclose the genuine core of the unity inherent in the traditional spirit. A unity that proves resilient not only in the face of differences, but even through the sharpest and most tragic clashes. Why? Because that's the breaking point. That's the moment in which you summon the darkest forces of the chthonic world and of your own lower nature, as a matter of fact, to defeat them and transcend into heaven. What do you think that the indulgences claim, that if you died in specific circumstances, you can debate how this was regulated, but in line of metaphysical principle, you could earn heaven accordingly. Right? There are so many aspects of this. I'm not claiming, again, to cover them in this video, but just to make an example, the Night of the Swan, right? The migration from the polar north in the European traditions, the events like, in this sense, like saying the European invasion, the Sea Peoples, the Romans conquering Egypt by ship, so to say, after Actium, even though they had already taken it over, but for good, the Crusaders moving east in order to recover the holy city, the citadel, the Asgard. What do you think? Do you think that a Norwegian crusader in the 12th century did not understand in Jerusalem exactly that heavenly center, according to also like his Norse sagas background, right? The entire world told the same identical story, and that breaking point was indeed that moment of measure, as we said before. I would always, as I always do, point out during these crusade videos that, everybody's fine and absolutely as it should be done, glorifying the Macedonian conquest of Levant, right? But when, of course, like in the conventional culture, at least for the left dominance on it, but we talk about the Crusades, at least that's also, oh my God, it's a problem. Oh, look at the Crusades. Like, they were doing exactly the same thing that the West had the divine mandate to do throughout all history, like today for that matter. Aside even from the obvious reason that the Islamic invasions had historically done the same in the opposite direction and ultimately failing, right? If you are sort of concerned about the fact that the Crusades in the Levant at least weren't particularly successful in the end, you should look at what happened to the Islamic world from the peak of its power to the one of its fall. You also know what happened further later. Now, the sense of fighting for recomposing a world unity was proper of the so-called monotheisms. That is yet another superfluous term that does not mean anything, just like polytheism for that matter. And informed, for example, the official reason for Columbus's voyages, right? The ultimate point from the perspective of the Catholic kings of Spain was to arrive in the East, in Japan, and to not just obviously profit from this extraordinary maritime connection, but to essentially convince the great powers of the East, in particular China, and its also Mongol legacy, to convert to Christianity and strangle Islam in a pincer movement. Right, so certain ideas also about modernity that we have somehow been fed, such as, for example, that the discovery of the Americas was something, more important than, for example, the Reformation, right? That something heavily bad, right, in terms of historical awareness and basic sort of also political, religious sort of insight from the era. And these things are all well documented. I like being contrarian to an extent because to get things right, because in order to explain them properly, I should always make a video for each of these statements, for example. But they must be said clearly at the beginning of this video so that people don't start having strange ideas on top of the ones that they normally have, as they normally can't understand, even a 10% of what I'm saying in this videos for that matter, because their head is crowded with things that, frankly, are not worth even mentioning or bothering ourselves to address. Now, by contrast, today we talk essentially about the Crusades because at large they were waged against the Muslims, but there is also a broader concept of infidelity and of schismatic, for example, or pre-Christian, at that point called pagan identity that was obviously culpable, right? We've seen what happened to Constantinople in 1204, which was not some random occurrence, even in terms of the relation between the two churches, even though it was something, aside from, it was basically the Byzantines' fault in the matter, because they called literally the Crusaders, promising them some specific pay support for the same. The Crusaders had stormed the city and not sacked it, and only eventually they stormed it again in the same sequence as 1204 for that reason. So we should be very proper about this. Today I will not even descend in things like what happened, for example, to the Christians and the Jews of Jerusalem in 1099, or what happened to the heretics in Occitania, and as statements like God will recognize his own, the latter in particular is incredibly consistent, coherent, and morally justified, not by a relative sort of morality of the era, but by a very strong political and strategical, in that instance, motivation. We will see that very well. And it's really incredible that there is no widespread awareness of this, that this is not a matter of what you think about Christianity, about religion, about the Crusades. I mean, objectively, who cares about people's opinions? Do we still live in a world where people care about that? What matters is the truth. Like, people are completely irrelevant. This is the point. There is a history. It's been demonstrated. There is a specific historiographical production that deals with this with incredibly meticulous capacity, and only when this gets polluted by some very recently, by the way, in history, because these things had always been known, for that matter, for centuries and centuries in European historiography, that people start departing, by the way, from normally this political, evenemential, decisional history, and starting to talk mostly about, structures, socio-economical, whatever. You already understand what the ideological matrix of that is. Of course, people start believing, and very specific kind of people, unfortunately, because they are the majority, that's their sort of getaway from any kind of responsibility or human worth or whatever. But just to make an example about the idea of the schism, Dante Alighieri, the voice of medieval civilization, a man of incredible culture, represented also purposely, as far as different idea, because they believed these things at the time, while also understanding the complexity of it all, considered Muhammad a schismatic Christian bishop, right? Because the starting point of the plenitude of Roman Catholic Christianity could not admit any other diversion, if not properly by confusion. And this is also a very metaphysically consistent idea of doctrine, of faith, of the truth, of divinity. So, as you understand, there are very different paths we could follow. Today, we look at the bloody history of the Crusades mostly by realizing that this confrontation was waged, was literally happened historically, and to the scale that we know, in the name of a proper holy war, right? And both Christianity and Islam, given that we're talking about them, we could easily shift this to any other people, offer equally compelling evidence of that shared traditional spiritual foundation, right? There were peoples, for example, it's true that Crusades were something relatively new, not new in the sense that they started by 1095, that's just like the canonic kind of, okay, we start counting certain specific expeditions because they happen in a very specific context with a very specific mechanism, but Crusades, and in that sense also from an institutional, definitional way, had already been happening in the same West with the same characteristics, in the Western Mediterranean in particular, during the 11th century. And again, they had really an enormous root and tradition in the previous ones as well. We were just talking about it yesterday as far as the Spanish military orders, because where's the boundary? If not from a documentary point of view, that between the monastic military orders, their congregations, their ascetic devotion, and the war bands of antiquity, the fiannas, the comitatus, the ver sacrum, etc. You can't find that. Just like you can't find the starting point of chivalry, of knighthood, the same language that we speak, as we've seen in the series about Indo-European theology, revolves around cosmic struggle, right? It's a sacred language, a military and religious one alike, actually including all possible meanings for that matter. The Middle Ages also provide us with the holy war in its broader political and military reality. This is not just some strange mechanism that reoccurred, again, just out of some strange deterministic reason that these actors did not even understand themselves, right? These were very precise, conscious choices with very equally precise, conscious objectives that also existed, again, within a broader set of holy war, military expeditions, and lifestyle that would be conducive and already habituated to. We're looking at that, for example, for Fulk Nera, in my recent videos about his encapsulation efforts in the County of Anjou. Again, as a 10th century Western Frankish prince, he would go several times over to the Holy Land, way before the Crusades as we intend them, and even predating, in fact, I don't know, the Normans, even though those were basically around there too. So remember this other aspect. It was not explicitly stated or even documented, historically speaking. It's not like it never existed, or that you can't say that it existed, especially if you have an adequately comprehensive, diachronic, and comparative understanding of history of religions and warfare, which is admittedly something very difficult to seriously get in this world. Now, the broader context of the Crusades is laden with elements that endow them with a deep symbolic and spiritual resonance alike. Right? In other words, the doctrine of being and becoming, the famous doctrine of the two natures, that is really the only possible compass through which you can understand history of religions and properly traditional wisdom. The Crusades, as such, that we're discussing at least today, are the canonic ones. So primarily the one fought between 1095 and 1291, launched by Western European Christians to recapture Jerusalem and the holy sites in the Levant from Islamic control following Pope Urban II's call at the Council of Clermont in 1095. Crusades, as we've seen very often in our series about, for example, the 1683 siege of Vienna, Prince Eugene, his successes against the Ottomans, but there are much more recent echoes of this as well, right? Asking for sort of God's blessing before a major war is something we have really seen in our lifetime, right? And it's even probably by the United States. So we're realizing that in many ways the same matrix resonates across the years in a much more frequent way than we understand. The medievals that did not know to be medievals, naturally, did not really think that at the fall of Acre, that I made an entire video reconstructing the siege of by the Mamluks, dislodging the Crusaders, brought an end to the Crusades. Right? We've seen very famous late medieval orders, including the one of the Dragon. And this is just anecdotal. Of course, there was plenty of them that were created to fight against the Ottoman threat, in that case in Central Europe, the Balkans. There was a general, again, sense that schismatic, the sense, for example, Eastern Orthodox and non in the sense uniate Eastern Catholic at some point, elements were essentially nothing better than the same Saracens. There is a great deal of, again, struggle during the Turkish wars in the 16th, in the 17th century. I will complete also the series that I just started, at least last year, on that. The endeavor to capture the Holy Land beyond the sea, however, and these terms are not random, they're not contingent. This stuff existed, as we'll see now, for millennia, reveals far more than is often recognized strong links, in fact, to ancient traditions, describing a blessed domain located in the Far East, where the sun rises, the happy region of the Azen, with the holy city of Ayard, where death holds no sway and wayfarers enjoy celestial serenity and eternal life. You will say Ayard, as a matter of fact, in French. Well, yes, this means garden. It's something very much connected, as you know, with the idea of paradise, the Persian originary term denoting, in fact, some specific sort of evergreen, ever watered, magnificent, heavenly gardens. As a matter of fact, it's a bit like the Garden of Eden, the Golden Age. In fact, paradise on earth. That would be echoing terminologically, at least phonetically, the same Asgard that we were talking about before, right? This domain is to be understood as one of the symbolic representations of the center of the world. Naturally, this is not merely a geographical center. This is a metaphysical center, right? It is essentially referring to the transition, the meeting point. Remember the idea of the pontifex that truly bridges the gap between mankind and heaven. The papacy here has a role still in that. Well, this is understood, of course, in terms of divine transcendence, essentially through self-sacrifice into holy combat that can be achieved in different ways, including actual warfare, say conventionally earthly warfare. It can be achieved also through sainthood, sometimes even literally in the same way, because Louis IX, the saint, one of the greatest heroes of the Crusading era, and also one of the greatest rulers in medieval Europe, incarnated exactly the same model, right? And here we're not talking how you can attain divinity per se, but obviously when we talk about the Crusades, the older evocative power, again, of those forces need to be tamed and dealt with, right? Is liberatory, is opening to a higher dimension that by just turning to the other side, not wanting to fight in any meaningful psychomachic sense and beyond with your own sort of incarnated body, like, will not allow you to transcend your same mortality. Remember always that the only reason why we're mortal is fear of death itself, right? As we were saying before with the Asgard and the French Ayard, obviously French was the main language of the Crusade. You understand how deeply interwoven the symbolism is with the motives from the Nordic tradition, among others. For Ayard is nothing other than Asgard, the celestial fortified realm in Norse mythology that serves as the home of the Aesir gods, including Odin and Thor, and encompasses halls such as Valhalla, the afterlife abode for warriors slain in battle. All cultures had this idea. The Romans had it. We've seen like the white towers of the Khazar world that the Varangians storm and sort of purify truly from the previous connection had it. You can find plenty of this also in the Celtic, although obviously like the later Gaelic sort of religious literary tradition that arrived to us through the Arthurian legend and beyond. These are all things that we have to properly describe in determinate videos. And some of you say, but you're buying time. No, it's literally we're doing a video after the other, and we're trying to bridge all gaps possible. And as you see here, we have already gone with videos on the subject pretty far. We're continuing in any case. Now, from the very beginning, when you look at the Crusades, the opposition to Islam naturally overlapped in many respects with ascetic practice. We were talking about the rebats yesterday and how the same Spanish, the same Iberian holy war at some point shared certain traits with this very promiscuous world, with the Muslims, with the Saracens, with these warrior brotherhoods that again existed all over the world. It was completely normal, completely structured and systemic for all of them, that required, just like in the monastery, this initial withdrawal from the seculum in order to gain the spiritual ascents necessary to go out there and mold the world in your own image. In fact, monks, also for the record, during the Middle Ages, did not really live on the presupposition that they had to be secluded from the world. On the contrary, monasteries had to be accessible, open. They had to be sheltered enough to allow for that ascetic lifestyle. But at some point, there had to be veritable action. Also, in late antiquity, there were some specific traditions, for example, in southern Gaul, where you have the Lorrain monasteries that were properly secluded on an island facing the Côte d'Azur, that was isolated enough, really, but at a relatively short distance as a crow flies. There was the episcopal see of Arles that had become the prefecture of Gaul and was one of the most important churches in Gaul, and the bishops of the same diocese were required to have spent this adequate time in monastic experience in the Lorrain. Then eventually in Western history, the secular monastic path are sort of separated and also antagonistic with one another. But these were all sort of practices dating back also to previous times. War during the Crusades did not concern the kingdoms of this earth, but the kingdom of heaven, at least as an aim, as a trajectory. Of course, war did involve the lower nature, the earthly human dimension, but it was war was understood as just the medium for transcending it, to go beyond, to enter the higher condition of eternal life. The Crusades were in no sense a human enterprise, thus, but belonged to God for this very reason, right? God would choose, and this was also notoriously stressed, again, about any war at the time, the winner according to the normal, again, millenary Trinitarian understanding existing way before Christianity, where truly the Son, in virtue of his works, of his deeds, receive from the Father the Holy Ghost, and therefore all three reunite into the divine dimension. For this reason, when you think about this from a cultural, historiographical point of view, like, why do we keep judging the Crusades by the criteria used for ordinary human events? Naturally, there are lots of studies on these spiritual matters as well, but aside from the general hyper-specialization, sort of fragmenting also more comprehensive picture of the whole, you realize that historiography normally does not go there. If you go to university, like, you're not taught Crusader history through this lens, right? This is not an idealistic, simply metaphysical perception where you should just be fundamentally just specialized in a particularly niche field to approach the topic through this lens. It's literally like the whole point of the Crusades was this, right? Their moral dimension, their justification, their impact also on the West as a broader civilization and the other ones involved in the struggle are big, right? Are enormous, right? It's not merely, a video game where there is a faction that has a crusade function and the other doesn't, and sort of the others are kind of the enemies, and in between there is nothing, or there's not an overall impact on, as a product, by the way, of the peak of medieval civilization on the rest of history. And we're very close, actually, to those events, if you think about it in historical perspective. In that period, the Holy War was perceived as a purely spiritual struggle, or at least aspirationally purely, because had it successfully been achieved as a purely spiritual struggle, of course, also divinity, the recompaction of the world under divine rule would have occurred. And so this effort had always been at the root of warfare, of the sacred war bands, of the sort of elite corps that at this point historically dominated also an establishment in the age of feudalism, of chivalry, as depositories, as collectors of the great millenary tradition of holy war. There is a chronicler of the time that uses this phrase, that, speaking of this crusading effect, was a washing that is almost a fire of purgatory before death, right? This obviously aligns dramatically well with Indo-European theology, where he who drinks the sacred soma, but it is the Holy Ghost, basically, must be virtuous, otherwise he will be burned and destroyed. And it's self-sacrifice that was this highest and most risky enterprise that will have the hero achieve eternal life, quote, as moth into the flame, right? Just to cite a famous Vedic passage, because the idea is that fire, that is understood as of course, like a metaphorical, or at least a metaphysical fire to begin with, is truly the gateway to transcendence. If you're not strong enough to surpass it, you will burn into it. Hence also the concept of hell, right, that at different times was considered in different terms, more like a non-place and non-existence of something actually more somber, etc. But aside from the volcanic connections of the netherworld and the telluric, in fact, presence, let's say, of the larval dimension of the totemic soma after death, as opposed to in fact, the major soul of men that would have hopefully won over so-called second death was judgment, flying to heaven, in case. Hell is truly, and say the flames of it, are truly the purifying element of the mechanism. If you don't, as you know, Christ went to hell before resurrecting because there could have not been but that test, right, in order to understand whether a soul was able to ascend heaven and so to transcend mortality itself, right? So even the great Romanesque frescoes in this dark, kind of still compressed space of the higher Middle Ages before the splendid ethereal Apollonian Gothic, right? That the walls of which were made of pure light, or pure divinity of heaven, essentially, well represent also the different predisposition as a moral measure of the age before and after the Crusade, but still quite beautifully explain how fire was always understood as purificatory, and so also the medieval hell, Dante's Inferno, and so on, resume such powerful imagery, just as the same purgatory. As a matter of fact, it is understood, as you know, just to stick to Dante, as a truly sort of continuation of human experience, right? That is understood as a penalty, especially when judgment has been delivered and the soul knows the truth of it all. And so in what his punishment or reward, for that matter, means in absolute terms in front of God. Those who fell in the Crusades were compared by popes and preachers to literal gold, thrice tested and 7 times purified in the fire, so as to gain grace before the Supreme Lord. This was the ultimate judgment, was the ultimate war, right? If you think about this also in strategic terms, such big expeditions were really rare. They were much more shorter ranged at the time. There wasn't a higher motivation, both in heavenly and earthly terms, than the one that the Crusades had offered. It was a higher opportunity for everybody involved. They made a lot of sense under any point of view. So there was a full motivation and as such a full reward, right? Naturally, we're not going to theologically split here and say, well, okay, the struggle of man in that sense is still always measured on the basis of his achievements. There were ways in theory to gain heaven also through your normal deeds in a non-crusade, right? But still, as we said before, we shouldn't also fall into the trap of considering normal warfare elsewhere as non-religious, not blessed, not holy. Papal endorsement, excommunication, communication vows before battles, crosses, saints were all over, right? This also in cultures that did not launch crusades, such as the Byzantines. Actually, the only one that confirms the rule of the fact that they didn't conceive the crusade as such were against the Bogomils, because against the Bogomils and Gnostic heretics, of course, you're going to do so yourself. And in general, you can appreciate how the entire motivational struggle of the Saeculum had historically been military in nature. If you go back to St. Ambrose, if you look at the posture of the church towards the imperium, there had always been a repetition of the military and the priestly function that sometimes could and would overlap, right? So much so that when we look at the investiture controversy or the later quarrels, I don't know, between Boniface VIII and Philip the Fair of France, etc., people say, oh, look, this thing was actually collapsing to pieces. It's true that universal tradition was about to sort of fade very brutally with the great crisis of medieval civilization in the mid-14th century. So this is true for the entirety of the world. So that a world that would become ever more, in fact, fragmented, nation-based, modern, secular, with also the persistent or just the reappearance of certain specific heresies that were, however, more a product of the disarticulation of a much bigger and collectively understood as ecumenic of a system. But the investiture controversy itself and the general relations between the papacy and the empire dated back really as not as an ambiguity, but as an obvious pursuit of power that would really at that point measure where the Holy Ghost would land, so to say, out of merit, right? So that Boniface VIII proclaiming himself Caesar, right? Just like, by the way, Philip IV of France would do. It's not so strange, after all, because the same church had always had a degree of temporal power, and the same emperors had always believed to have, and they were recognized to an extent as such, to have sacred aura, and in that sense, in fact, imperium, right to imperium wielding out of merit, out of virtue, right? This was never quite fully denied, and officially so by both powers. There were just ferocious struggles for control, but the metaphysical fundamentals were the ones of millennia before, right? In theory, all power is possessed by the divine ruler, but when this splits down, it's so together with the rest of mankind metaphysically, and you have different, again, from the age of kings you pass to consensus of noblemen, and then you have, again, the imperium separated from the sacerdotism and so on. You're not looking at a denial or a canceling, but essentially a system that cannot keep this wall together, right? The Muslims, for example, choose not to have a priesthood separated from lay authority. They're just humans in an age where, the world had already quite strongly degenerated. What does happen to the Islamic Empire? As soon as it's created, it collapses, right? It fragments, it never reunites, not even sort of aspirationally. So in practical terms, what happens in the West is actually much more functional, because the objective of restoring that unity by sort of splitting powers and maintaining them, however, cooperating as they always would, right, until secularization in the 19th century, and regardless of quarrels between the persons owning the offices, but not between the offices per se, will also give rise to some of the greatest achievements of Western civilization. I mean, I've never heard online anywhere any reference in memes and pop culture, whatever, to the radical, magnitudinal, ecumenic impact of the investiture controversy from a sheer civilization point of view, theologically, legally, all the package of sort of institutions, administration, power wielding, including warfare. We talk about the Decretum Gratiani, one of the greatest chapters in the entire history of mankind, easily more important alone than the history of multiple continents. Nobody even talks about this. Well, if you don't understand that the entire engine for this mechanism was based on the Crusade concept as well, and its precedents that were even stronger actually compared to medieval civilization in the past, well, you have missed the entire meaning of Western civilization. Essentially, you're not a Western person. Doesn't matter where you were raised or how or by whom. It has absolutely no meaning for you to claim Western identity, because you literally haven't the palest idea of what the struggle in itself means and through what it passed historically, right? If you can't measure yourself as an individual against this immense background of your, even just the sole chapter alone in Western history is concerned, you're worthless. You're null. There's no consistency. It's a further hologramic degeneration of your person, as opposed to any divine transcendental work. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, 1090-1153, as you know, the prominent Cistercian abbot, influential church reformer who strongly supported the Second Crusade and wrote to promote the Knights Templar, said, quote, "Never forget this oracle." In the Laude Nove Militia, his masterpiece, insisted, says, "Whether we live or whether we die, we belong to the Lord. What glory for you never to leave the fray except covered with laurels. But what greater glory could there be than to win on the battlefield an immortal crown? Oh, happy condition in which one can await death without fear, desire it eagerly and receive it with steadfastness." Right? I mean, the gladiatorial Mooner had the same meaning in Romanity, except those were contemplated for the fourth estaters that were given a chance to redeem themselves in death. So just through sort of a lower kind, but the entire sense of essentially fighting in line of duty without any consideration whatsoever for your destiny, as long as you slaughter as many people as possible along the way, is the highest and purest principle of traditional wisdom, right? If you can truly defeat the enemy, even just without inciting this war, it would be fantastic, just subjugating everyone, right? But in this mortal valley of sorrow, as we've seen also from the numerous penitentials in medieval history, you must be able to sacrifice, you must be able to tame, you must be able to destroy just to get the power that allows you to rise to heaven, right? This does not go without sin. Again, this bloodshed is, in the sense, if you're not able to convince your opponent of the worthiness of your cause to make him stand down and drop his weapons, you fail, right? But sometimes certain things are going to happen that are much worse than that. And at that point, if you can't do else, you will kill, right? And that is what we go to by earthly standards. What is naturally obvious is that in the Laude Nove Militia, that refers, by the way, to the Templar, quote-unquote, militia, that does not mean militia in English. It has to do actually with the highest principle of nobility in arms and as a freeman in arms, which is what the Latin militia has to do, just like the Pauline militia Christi that was properly expressed together with that Roman militarized language exactly to galvanize the imperial sort of fantasy of the Gentiles at that point. Otherwise, Christianity would have not spread, by the way, is exactly what these actors were pursuing, right? Cistercian abbots, here we mentioned Bernard of Clairvaux, were prominent, as we've seen just yesterday in the video about the Spanish monastic military orders, in the establishment of the same communities, right? We've seen how Alcantara, the same Calatrava, were founded with a Cistercian rule, Santiago de Augustinian one, for that matter. Cistercians were specializing, as you know, in land exploitation. They started from France, they spread all across Europe. They bred war horses to be shipped to the Holy Land, as a matter of fact. And so I would like to stress this as part of a broader system that was universally revolving around the mounted military elite, right? You have an idea of, in relative terms, of what, also in absolute ones for that matter, a knight costs for a pre-industrial society, right? Even just the level, like the years of study for a priest to be able to indoctrinate a knight for the sake of holy war and achieving properly that self-sacrificial standard, action and contemplation alike. The purpose of the Templars, the Hospitalier, the Teutons, and so on, was the one of essentially taking the field, if we're talking about the elite knighted brethren, because there were also some heretic news, a bit like in the rest of military organization, was to take down easily 30 people, right, before being killed. Like, that was the goal, right, of a standard, and that's also how, thanks to them, the Holy Land resisted against the Islamic onslaught, right? The Kingdom of Jerusalem in particular was endowed with an overwhelmingly advantageous position. This is a very underrated factor politically and territorially, but that was the great problem of the Crusades, that already at that point, the world had sort of descended into a status of torpor where the greatest problem of the Ottoman states was shortage of manpower. But in general, like, this is the great difference. Those who were fighting and dying in the Holy Land were much more motivated and trained. The monastic military orders being probably the peak of it. They were armored and armed in the same identical way of any other knight out there, aside from the dress and recognition badges and so on. They were the same identical military sort of hardware, but the software was something else. The software was really something else, and that's how these people were trained to fight, knowing that it didn't matter, right, whether they died or not, because the worst thing can happen on a battlefield is you to give way to the enemy without having given your best to him, right? That will essentially kill you without having spent your absolute potential that is theoretically divine, and that's what all these figures were trying to attain, what they were really seeking. Naturally, we've seen in many videos about Crusades warfare how, of course, the monastic military orders could be mistaken, could be defeated, all this stuff. Like, this is completely normal for any unit in history. But consider, in this sense, the environment in which they were bred, raised, and brought to the battlefield, because also the other players involved were really impressed by these elite picked units' behavior. The Crusader was promised in all this, in French, gloire absolue. So absolute glory, meaning, from properly the etymological definition, absolutus, which not just has to do with the idea of absolution from all sin, but in the sense of properly liberation from any tie. That's what absolute actually means. It means that your boundaries are dissolved and that your soul, like in the megalosychia of Alexander, can take over the entire world in the process, right? And these were men, of course, that would gain sanctity in their view, in death, and therefore, in practice, also, according to St. Christian theology, a level of immortality that was qualitatively, in fact, superior to those who were to be damned in hell. That in practice would also mean that they would cease to exist, right? This divide was the same one that existed in Rome theologically, especially in origin between the patricians and the plebeians. The patricians were the feudal estate of Rome. I also made a video about properly Roman feudal warfare, that is an actual military era of Rome that people do not understand in that meaning, where those guys had partly attained divinity and could continue in the sense to interlocute with their ancestors in heaven, and also command the lower plebeian element that instead was sort of more chthonic, did not have hearers, etc. Of course, to a degree, they all descended from God, but to that secular standard, there was a radical divide that is functional from a military standpoint. But also, this sacrifice is functional for the entire world. So it's not like the patrician is fighting only for himself. Otherwise, we would have not had the Camillian reform, would have not had a Roman Empire, where also a plebeian of the chosen people of God of Rome was obviously a much higher kind than whoever he had conquered, obviously. The achiever could thus rest in paradise, conveyed in the rugged warrior idiom of the era as conquer lit en paradis, corresponding precisely, in fact, to the same supernatural repose in the Surah An-Naba in the Quran, for example. That heavily drew, by the way, from Persian, right, Iranian holy war, historically. The Sasanians had, by the way, just to go back to antiquity, the early Middle Ages at that point, the same identical principle. We've seen it also in the video about the rise and fall of the Iranian tradition, so to say, right? So the goal of every knight that must be, according to all our old poems, to conquer a bed in paradise. These rough men of war who had traveled so many roads, endured the harshness of so many climates, slept so many nights on the hard ground, and spent so many days without unlacing their helmets or removing their hauberks. Some of this was literally mandated even within the monasteries in times of peace, right, to habituate them to that privation. And so this is not a naive idea they formed in a sense of eternal beatitude, resting in a good bed, like treating really earthly life as the moment of greater struggle, the one that can really earn you credit in a heavenly dimension where you suffer throughout all this existence in order to achieve the greatest result ever, so that you can finally rest in the afterlife, that you will have won, right? It is actually very metaphysical and very elevated, right? It may sound simple, but that's exactly what tradition boils down to. It is true, right? He who dies will have his bed prepared with the innocent, says the Bishop of Puy in his fine harangue beneath the walls of Antioch, right? And that is his peroration. Quote, "In the great paradise, your places are all ready," cries Turpin on the battlefield of Roncevaux. Right? In the great paradise, your places are all ready. I also made a video about Roman heaven in Virgil's fourth eclogue, for that matter. That is one of the most striking visions of an otherwise, again, primitively and ancestrally, well, sort of innerly maintained idea of Roman heaven that the Italics already had, and that surely excited their fantasies of conquest during the creation of the empire back in Roman times. Roncevaux, by the way, where the noblest blood on earth is about to flow, as Roland self-sacrifice saves the same army of Charlemagne, right, that he successfully distances from the Moors, even though there were also Christians from the other side in the historical battle. If anything, we will look at through mostly the legend at this song, the Chanson de Roland. And we've seen also how the Chanson de Geste, deeply as a literary production, so to say, was actually expressing a concept of translatio imperii. Essentially, the greatest heroes of the Franks were the ones who had truly earned their place in heaven and could therefore dialogue with the leaders of the Frankish Empire by Carolingian times by a truly ecumenic scale. This is incredibly important to stress, and how violent and bloody this mentality in society was, meaning that if you're a Christian and you believe this, obviously you are perfectly aware that the language of the gospel is not pacific at all. I mean, the only peace to be attained refers to the higher nature, right, and is heavenly, because it's absolute. It couldn't be otherwise. Indo-European theology is the same identical thing. The earthly world, and Christ is very open about this, right, that the verbum will cause a deep fracture, will bring war, because the world has stopped saving itself, right? It's exactly the moment in which we witness also in other cultures that the shift happens, where the age of heroes, right, was simply giving way to the age of men, that a new reinforcement of the idea of a divine attainment from a human nature with a divine potential that grows also during Christ's life itself was necessary for mankind to reflect on their metaphysical condition and the possibility to reactivate as well. The Crusades were understood as the pinnacle of such means of attainment, to say the least. Right? The celestial reward is elsewhere in the sources presented in the form of a beautiful garden, we said before. This is an imagery that flows also from the east, as we said before. The Persian gardens is something that the Arabs themselves bring from the East after that Iranian vision of paradise, where old soldiers who died in the service of Christ rest. And this is the meaning that must be attached to those, quote, holy flowers, so often mentioned in the Chanson de Roland as well. We've seen this actually in the Virgilian fourth eclogue and in other passages of Virgil's work, where essentially the island of the dead that are the ones who made it into the true after the true life, right, after the Mars Triumphalis, across the ocean. And that's exactly also how it's depicted in Dante, for that matter, is entirely transfigured. Like the sheep have a purpureal wool, the wheat fields are literally golden, right? So this entire world is divinely transfigured. It's the same identical imagery. It's the same identical meaning, right? The Valhalla, in many ways, is the same concept, even though, again, it can be represented in different ways depending on how literature eventually modulated it. But the highest concept is the one also of the end time struggle that is, of course, present also in Christianity. And it's absolutely wrong that Christianity was the religion that brought about a concept of linear history. This was present in all, especially the Apollonian cultures, in all the one of warriors, of conquerors, for that matter. There is an end time. There is an ultimate judgment that will metaphysically set everything in the way it must, where essentially God will win thanks to the ranks of the heroes that have fallen into holy war and that are swelling the heavens, right, as they are truly the stars in the firmament themselves, and all the various heavens levels, as you know, in Christian metaphysics, etc. So it's all incredibly and fully coherent with what we have always seen also in ancient religion. The more familiar image of the crown also comes to the minds of our fathers. Quote, those who die here will have up there a crown of flowers. And there is a line from the Charroi de Nîmes that sums up the entire life of the Christian knight in 10 syllables. Quote, he did so much on earth that he is crowned in heaven. Right? Who was crowned in ancient Rome? Of course, the victorious imperator, who was Jupiter himself, with the red painted face as properly the symbol of the rising sun, of the Sol Invictus. As a matter of fact, this is a much older concept than any sort of Iranian influence of that also contained that, of course, in Mithraism in late antiquity. This stuff existed in archaic Italy from a very long time. And what does the victorious imperator do? He rises to the Asgard, that is the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitol Hill, and there he renders to God what has been given just through his Holy Ghost, his imperium, his power, right? And this is to tribute truly to heaven, what is of heaven, just like during the emperor's funeral, where in the Decursio, the Roman knights galloped around, in circle around the burning pyre, where a live eagle was freed from flying in heaven as the transfigured soul of the emperor by throwing their own decorations, one under their leader, into the pyre itself. So, and the purifying fire, remember what I said before about hell, and so this is literally all of it. It is the same identical belief. There is literally nothing that changes in all of that. You attain divinity on the battlefield, and you're able to transcend divine, just like Caesar that literally becomes a comet, right? The Chanson de Roland, obviously, it dates to a much older tradition, but is, as we know it, an 11th century old French epic poem, the oldest major work, in fact, of French literature in that form, that glorifies the heroic deeds of Charlemagne's paladin Roland at the Battle of Roncevaux Pass in 1778, where he and his companions, including the warrior Archbishop Turpin that we mentioned before, stating this in the Chanson, die fighting Saracens in a dramatized, Christianized retelling of the historical Basque ambush. The Charroi de Nîmes that we mentioned before is a 12th century chanson de geste from the Guillaume d'Orange cycle, depicting the Canning conquest of the Saracen-held city of Nîmes by the Frankish hero Guillaume through a ruse involving hidden knights in merchant carts. For those who tell, but your sources. Jerusalem, the central aim of the crusading effort, thus appeared in itself in a twofold light, as an earthly city and simultaneously as a heavenly one. In fact, in the Jewish Christian tradition, Jerusalem was moreover frequently viewed as an image of the mysterious Salem, whose king was Melchizedek, the enigmatic priest king of Salem mentioned in Genesis 14, who blesses Abraham and is traditionally identified in biblical exegesis as an early type or foreshadowing of Christ, with Salem understood, in fact, as an ancient name or precursor site associated with that became Jerusalem, in fact. This is particularly important because the fact that Melchizedek, that as you know is a very famous figure, in fact, of the Crusade, at least contemporary literature. Have you ever read Melchizedek and Saladin? There are beautiful novels also by Boccaccio. It's very recurrent, right? It's like the Priester John, like these figures that emerge in an archetypal, metaphorical sense. There is all a specific tradition. That's Priester John is connected, by the way, with the Golden Bow that we were talking about in our recent videos, also about the traditional role of kingship and the woman. So the fact that Melchizedek was a priest and a king at the same time is what also you see from the Semitic tradition that share the same concepts, because it's not, again, it's a radically divine things. It's just like, if anything, predisposition, or at least over time, something that changed in moral tension. Gilgamesh perishes, he fails, right? So the Indo-European world saw still like victory is feasible, and that's how late in Western history as sort of self-salvation could be ideally attained. Like, this obviously had a lot to do with what happened to the Templars later that we had never discussed, but that, as you know, is also quite famous with Baphomet, with all unfortunately kind of lost, but sort of almost easily guessable kind of sort of train of theological thinking, so to say. The unity of priesthood and kingship is truly the one of the heroes in the Indo-European tradition. It's Romulus, right? Is what we were saying before regarding, for example, at some point by the Common Era, church and empire were separated. Church and state, if anything, were separated because there were two different functions, the priestly and the military, that were more sort of repartitionally separate, specialized, right? And the ancient unity was seen in Jerusalem. That's why we're talking about this, because Jerusalem in itself mirrored Salem, mirrored the idea that the return of Christ obviously would manifest through a glorious victory. And so whatever happened in Jerusalem was to be understood as an omen, at least as a gateway to another dimension in history, which also kind of turns out to be in different historical times. Now, in the context of heroic tradition, the crusade thereby took on the character of a rite of pilgrimage and the passion of a way of the cross. The best way that historiography defines the Crusades is a spiritual journey, an armed pilgrimage. They were all one, because this is the voyage of voyages. It is truly the ultimate destination and fate of those who are able to tame it, as a matter of fact. And so the true path of heroes, the true path of the northern conqueror that crosses the waters from the Hyperborean Sea and takes over the lower earth to rejuvenate it and to have like the golden bow sprouting once again. That's why also the deeds of the great leaders of Crusader expeditions it's so immense. Just think about, we've seen it, for example, in that video about the slumbering monarch in German tradition, like the figure of Frederick Barbarossa, that dies during the Third Crusade en route to Jerusalem, and this passing is seen as essentially a mystical departure, right? He was not really dead, he truly transfigured in a heavenly fashion. If you're familiar with the duodeciman Shia Islam, you know that this idea of the Imam that disappears behind the column is there. It means exactly that there is an immanent force of divinity that lives through these noumena, as the Romans would have understood them, that basically remain to protect and are waiting to wake up once again from the Valhalla, as a matter of fact, but as higher leaders. The same legion of Arthur, it's the same legion for many other rulers, Frederick II, not just his grandfather, with Charlemagne as well. So we've seen it in the video about Montjoie Saint-Denis, Mount of Jupiter, the Asgard there. It's basically as if the entire world moved, the entire France moved from the monastery where the Oriflamme banner, that is the same one of the Sol Invictus, was brought forth against the enemy, and where all, in fact, the sacred kings, the saints, repose, just like inside the mountain. And these mounts of Jupiters were present all across the former lands of the Western Roman Empire that we know of, and likely they were scattered everywhere else with the same celestial connotation, right? So Jerusalem, during the 11th century, that was obviously one of the most evocative symbols of even though Rome was truly more striking to all travelers, because we have many diaries for those pilgrimages. I mean, we know of Icelanders that traveled the entire Ether up to Jerusalem. They visited lots of cities, and even in Jerusalem, they say, okay, well, yeah, it's this place is the where Christ was crucified, and the various temples. The sense, however, is that when they arrive to Rome, they begin to write about Rome and every single thing they saw there. And of course, the holiness of Rome, the centrality, the meeting ground, the east of the west, in the papacy and the empire, lives forever in this Roman enterprise, because it's the Roman popes that launch the Crusades and even arrive to annihilate Constantinople indirectly in the process, right? So this aspect is incredibly powerful and fascinating, as much as the fact that the journey was not obviously a grand tour, a divertissement, but was a real passion, right? In other words, you had to bleed to really transcend your own nature. You had truly to self-sacrifice in order to show God that the most important truth went beyond your own existence, that you could truly be elevated to a higher condition by, of course, contributing, not with wishful thinking, but through the inspiration, for example, of Crusaders, if you were a contemplative prelate, but truly, and also, in fact, many men of church would follow the crusading armies that would also die in the process. But as a knight, you had truly to reconquer the Asgard and to truly acquire a sense of divinity, of kingship and priesthood. It's what Godfrey of Bouillon, for example, tries to maintain for himself, because of realizing how the papacy wanted to get direct control of that, also through the Gregorian legations that were developing exactly this point, and he sort of kept at least that temporal power of the church out. And this also allowed for the monastic military orders at some point to develop also some rights that we will see better, especially in the video about the Templars, that at some point, however, were not enough their effort eventually to maintain Jerusalem in the end. The military orders that played the most important role in the Crusades, such as the Knights Templar, founded around 1119, 1120, primarily to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land, evolving into a powerful monastic military order with papal endorsement and known for their, at least initially as you know, for their white mantles bearing a red cross, and the Knights of St. John, also known as the Knights Hospitalier, originating from a hospital in Jerusalem established before 1099 by Blessed Gerard to care for pilgrims, regardless of faith, later militarized in the 12th century to defend Christian holdings in the Levant, distinguished by their black mantle with a white eight-pointed cross, comprised men who, akin to Christian monks and ascetics, had learned to despise the vanity of this life. Into such orders withdrew warriors weary of the world, having seen and tasted all it had to offer, so as to direct their spirit toward something superior. This aspect is also fascinating. Before, we've seen the need of the passion, right, of spilling blood, whether your own or the one of the enemy, but obviously in this functional mechanism of conquest, right? So obviously not a self-destruction like the Gnostics, the heretics of the era would have preferred, right? Because they denied incarnation as a fall from divinity that can be reattained only through the same flesh that is all one with the soul, for that matter. Hematophilia was expressed, as we've seen also in some of the most beautiful songs of the dying late antiquity under early Clovis and his sacred blood, right? The Germanic peoples at that time still sacrificed as Christians, by the way, they're prisoners, just like in the previous centuries. The Pope Gregory the Great was worried about this. Were truly excited by blood division. This is especially the case for the Franks, but for the Saxons themselves, so much that their evangelization had to pass, as we've seen also in the beautiful Eastern Frankish literature of the 9th century, through images that would emphasize bloodshed, right? When Peter cuts the ear of the guard that has come to arrest Christ, well, it's not that there is an avalanche of blood, but the apostles are literally represented as a Germanic comitatus of the 9th century to garner more sort of direct, more graphically explicit parallelism between the Vodanic way that was followed by the Saxons and the more sort of elevated and sort of conceptualized one of the Franco-Roman civilization that had come to conquer them. So there is this, right? From the other, there is also the idea that what is this bloodshed functional to, really? It's actually the concept that without sin, without having tested the force of evil, you can't have the means to surpass it. Or at least you could if you are truly unspoiled, but it's quite unlikely, especially in human experience, as we know it. And that therefore, it's only after having gone through the world that you can at some point gain a higher wisdom to truly achieve something superior, right? Once you have tasted, as here this concept goes, everything that life had to give you. And we've seen what kind of background also the members of the monastic military orders had, right? They had been powerful people. They had been married. They had pursued also a lifetime of bloodshed, of warfare on their own. That it could be the most varied, right? It's not really strange that even like other famous warriors would, at the end of their lives, retire into a monastery, regardless of sort of knightly attainments, because you have to imagine in all this, also from a psychological point of view, that if you fail in this life to achieve what you want to achieve, the sense that you have to entrust yourself fully as you're losing forces and you realize you can't make it on your own, and in Christ, in God, and delegating to others that will have hopefully followed your higher example for the, as we've seen, swelling the ranks of the army of God in heaven. It's something at some point you have to accept, and or at least you have to prepare for, right? As much as self-sacrifice is the other path, right? And others wouldn't take. So it wasn't really for everyone, even for some of the greatest rulers and leaders of the era. In this texts, by the way, the maxim vita est militia super terram could be lived out completely, both internally and externally. The Romans said themselves, vivere militare est. So you understand that the same identical existential philosophy was both ancient Roman, medieval Christian. The knightly monks prepared themselves for battle with prayers and then advanced against the enemy. Their matan was the trumpet, their cilices the armor they rarely doffed. Their fortresses became monasteries, and the trophies seized from the infidels took the place of relics and images of saints. This was, aside from some sort of greater sort of physical suffering inflicted to literally, like, this was done, for example, in the initiatory rites of the sacred war bands of antiquity that also routinely killed a member every once in a while to keep very clear that they did not belong to anybody but to God, and that their leader was the medium of the same. You realize, in fact, that this kind of spirit was present not just among other crusaders, but in general in the warriors of the time. The same ascetic orientation paved the way for the spiritual realization that also connects to the hidden, esoteric side of chivalry. In that we know, through figures like Meister Eckhart, for example, surviving literally as a parallel doctrine to, let's say, you can say to Christianity, but within the same Christianity. From that, we realize that it wasn't fundamentally persecuted per se, right? This would be a very interesting topic for a video, that is to say, how much do we actually know about what knights thought, believed, and normally also educated themselves through, right? Aside from physical training, martial arts, and so on, that are far beyond, in that sense, what we see today in HEMA, or whoever thinks that reenactment has anything to do with it. We know very few, but the few that we know tells us that there was a fully fledged traditional body doctrine that was normally taught. In true means that were largely oral, as far as we understand, and or at some point, again, looked upon with relative suspicion by the church, that still, however, as we see also with the Templar militia, initially, Bernard of Clairvaux's teachings, at least in a more sort of ecclesiastical sense, was very glad to boost, to bolster. And we'll see this better in a video about the Templars, but you know what we're talking about. Now, the repeated military defeats suffered by the Crusades, though initially causing surprise and bewilderment, ultimately served to cleanse the enterprise of any remaining materialistic traces and to shift to the focus from the external to the internal, from the temporal to the spiritual. This is, after all, what the papacy had always privileged, actually bringing an end to the wars between Christians, going only at the infidels, whether, again, heretics, schismatics, Muslims, whoever would essentially threaten the expansion of Christendom across the world, with very great success, as a matter of fact, because the West, and we've seen it in many videos, was essentially already way more advanced by this point than most of its surroundings, and also in later history. We can still see today, it's just sheer deterrence and acquired power that, and the wisdom that comes with it, mostly, makes the same Western idle a little bit and allow for here and there some cracks, but with an incredibly resistant core. As we know, during the Middle Ages, Christians fought much more among each other, like everybody else, like in their respective religions for that matter, just out of contiguity. But that, indeed, the forces that Christian Europe had were immense compared to the one of its neighbors, as a matter of fact. And great part of the later, for example, global colonial power of the West is fundamentally built up, in fact, through these struggles within the same Christians. That are of a very different nature, if you think about it, compared to the rest of the surrounding peoples that are, I don't know, completely invaded by others, either erased or crumbling. Like in the West, more or less, those countries that existed in the Middle Ages, we have today, right? And more completely united by this shared background that already existed and was further constituting at the time. So not a destructive process, but a constructive one. By likening the unfortunate outcome of a crusade to the fate of virtue in misfortune, which finds its judgment and reward only in another life, works do matter, right? Catholicism is not there for some strange reason. One effectively established a principle higher than both victory and defeat. Remember what we said before, the necessity of sinning. Well, even defeat was thus much more meaningful and at least providing with much greater potential insight for revival and true overturn, as it would historically happen in later centuries, than merely a victorious ruler that, however, loses steam and is not able. It's a bit like the history of the Crusade themselves. Like the first crusade was a veritable miracle. It was a veritable manifestation of divine power on earth, right? It was truly mythical and epical. And also from a strictly, as a PhD in medieval warfare, it's extremely difficult to explain how the first crusade did literally succeed in practical terms, because it was an absolute masterpiece against all odds, right? And one that definitely displayed Western civilizational superiority. Then things start going down after that, and some powers also remain there. Think about the Italian fleets that remain in the ports, even that were present in the Levantine ports before the Crusades and after the Crusades. And all in all, in any case, the same Western powers remained compact and wouldn't give way to the Ottomans, differently from the Byzantines, for example, that you can argue literally opened the gates as a broader population of Romania to the Turks in order not to fall under the papacy. And what a beautiful deal they got. Now, all value was thereby concentrated in the ritual and sacrificial essence of the action performed for its own sake, regardless of visible earthly outcomes, as an offering meant to draw from the holocaust of the human element that absolute glory which bestows immortality. This is true in the sense that earthly achievements are actually a direct consequence of your spiritual power, but they do not necessarily align in sort of practical terms, depending exactly also on the degree by which God wants us to partake as external observers, by the way, in this achievement. Just to make an example, Christ wins over death. Does the world change, really? It does. It is transfigured, but is it transfigured now or eternally? Right? That is, in other words, if Christ has really arisen from the dead, where's the transcendence of the world? Where the most correct theological explanation is not just, again, this is true in eternal, and so that in the moment you can't sort of grasp it if you're not part of the higher nature yourself, but that in fact God wants to prove the necessity of the ultimate sacrifice, or his own son, as an example, as a Christomimesis, in fact, in the same Christianity for every Christian, not to strip us of the glory of God. That is to say, all of us can actually achieve what Christ achieved. We know that this isn't quite the case for us, because it was explained before at large. Christianity came around in a metaphysical and sort of historical, super historical sense, exactly because we needed that example, because we can't sort of save ourselves anymore. And and not even, this is debatable, let's say in the past, who actually fully saved oneself to 100% degree to transfigure the world. That's not clear, and at least this is not the video we should go in depth in order to answer. However, in this very sense, you can have a divine attainment or a saintly one that sort of defies the conventional indicators of earthly power because of the will of the same saint that wants you to simply think of how to attain. It's not simply to rest on a sort of temporary achievement that is null in comparison to the divine one in any case, and that surely speaks of merit and of how and why works are important, but that can never be the last step, right? That's why, for example, in the gospel you find the parabola saying that it's very unlikely, to say the least, that a quote-unquote rich can enter heaven. Not because there is anything ideologically against rich people, but because the Bible warns against those who can simply content themselves of a earthly limit, and as human nature tends to essentially remain idling at that point, it's stalling, right? So it's not like there is not a worth in that level of divine reward. It's that should be only the beginning, and you should actually never be tired of actual power, because contrary to what Gnostic heretics said, and how inexplicably, by the way, some even prominent conservatives have tried to put out without understanding anything about traditional metaphysics, there is no such thing like an evil power and a good power. Power manifests, point. All power comes from God, all right? So evil does not obtain power, right? If it has it and then falls from it because it crumbles, it's because there was some good in that titanic force before. And as such, it's just like Lucifer. It's not like he hadn't deserved all the power he had before his ultimate fall, right? So always be extremely precise about what you're discussing here, because this was exactly what the Crusaders concerned themselves with in a theological sense. And in this way, the Crusades themselves echoed the core meanings already identified in tradition, among other peoples in previous times, and also parallel ones, including maxims such as paradise is the shadow of the swords, or the blood of heroes is closer to God than the ink of philosophers, and the prayers of the devout, right? Because it speaks of tangible sacrifice, a real, actionable one, right? Not some merely contemplative one that eventually does not spend it in the war to transfigure it. And the idea of the seat of immortality as an island of heroes, or Valhalla, the court of heroes, is exactly the same identical concept, right? Those are those who actually made it, right? And it's all counterintuitive what this practically means for the average person today in particular. There is a double thread. It's just like the parabola of the rich that we just pointed out. If you're never really interpreted it in this way, it means that you don't have basically the moral compass to understand anything about history or theology that is entirely and exclusively based on this double-threaded level that is innerly coherent. But I understand, of course, most people reason just in monofactorial terms or banal dichotomies. The very same spirit that animated the warrior clash of Mazdaism, for example, the ancient Iranian religion centered on Aura Mazda as the supreme good deity in a cosmic struggle against evil, that is, in this sense, more like a competition. There were lots of, as you know, Manichaeans as well in that Eastern world. So in the Zoroastrian mentality, yes, there was this sort of already this tendency towards dualism, at least in picture, like the light and the darkness, etc. But of course, the original mechanism was absolutely the traditional Catholic one. And this struggle, rather than dualism, reappears when, for example, the followers of Mithra, the Roman mystery cult about, we said before, the solar warrior god popular among soldiers, derived only in part from Persian myth, but also adapted with elements of other beliefs and also ancestral, Italic, and universal ones in Europe. Plus elements of astrology, initiation, grades, and bull slaying iconography, at least developing further also throughout late antiquity, but having always a root to identify their cultic practice with the profession of arms, right? That had already existed. It's what we said just before, that the Quran draws heavily from Iranian holy war, right? So Mithraism actually sort of spoke of that as well, and in fact it's described as a religion of the soldiers, as if, by the way, Christianity hadn't been about that, as if, by the way, it hadn't been Christian soldiers. I made a video about St. Martin of Tours. It was, part of the Schola Palatina of Julian. You may want to appreciate the background, including, in fact, also Julian's own enotheistic Catholicism that, however, was surpassed by the Christian way to divinity. That was, again, part of the same Catholic struggle, but taking things in a slightly different way. Neophytes swore an oath, a sacramentum akin to the military one in Mithraism, and once initiated, they belonged to the sacred militia of the god of light. And I would like, in this sense, to stress that the Militia Christi was also a very old concept in and of itself. So we never have to think that these things were actually separated. I'm pretty sure, by the way, that there were Christian Mithraist Roman soldiers at some point, and that, regardless of the ambiguities and however they would have actually conceived this would have been actually also somehow a normal thing. It's the same reason why the Vodanic leaders of the early Middle Ages eventually were the first ones of their society to convert to Christianity, as opposed to the more Chthonic, lower people that were more into Chthonic superstition. In fact, the Telluric approach, right? The elites always were into the imperial Catholic tradition, depending on who was in command nation-wise. That's why you have the brutal struggle between the Franks and the Saxons, not much because the latter were still largely pre-Christian. Now, this conception of life is interesting, and especially of what we call the religious one, where the idea of struggle and victory was pretty much inherent. The same Christianity and Mithraism, for example, was manifestly present way before our era, the Common Era, right? It all came from the same ancient flow, and we find it also among the Diadochi up to the Crusades, and if you want, beyond, right? We've seen this, for example, in the Hermetic tradition and alchemy. There's also an underrated aspect to this, also considering the places of the holy sites that the Crusaders and the Muslims struggle over the control of. That is, the Levant itself in an age like the one of the Diadochi, right? The ones of Asia, with their military monarchies, made multiple videos about the Seleucids, about the Ptolemies, about the Attalids, even though, these were not mostly, as you know, the Syrian wars were fought over Palestine, Jerusalem. It was a very frontier area. And together with Lebanon, with Sinai, with Syria itself. And interestingly enough, and this is also sort of underrated, the Asiatic Diadochi had earlier connections with Mazdaean dualism, given that great part of their territories were also Persian themselves. And this is very much more valid for the Seleucids. The Bactrians were Buddhists, right? Some Zen Buddhism owes much to his founder in days that came from, it was a Greek from Bactria, as a matter of fact. So there is a lot going on from a much longer time. Consider, again, the Romans conquered the Levant, conquer Syria, in fact, put to sleep, so to say, the Seleucid Empire that had been also, frankly, the more more effective in preserving the Alexandrian legacy, that also sort of Anabatic sense, they also spent hundreds of years, as we've seen in different videos, fighting against the Persians. So it's obvious that these ideas were around for quite a while. We've seen actually that the pilgrimage to the Holy Land had never really stopped throughout the early Middle Ages. It's not like the Islamic invasions happened and there weren't Christians in Jerusalem, even from the West. This actually often happened. We've seen it recently again, Fulk-Nera, Harald Hardrada. This was normally done also for specific Christian leaders by Islamic rulers at some point. We know the oaths of allegiance that, for example, the Diadoches subjects had to swear to their masters that were divinized sovereigns. Think about attributions like Soter, which is the savior. For all the also Zeus's attributions of divine. So this was completely normal in also transcendental, transfiguring optic in Levant from quite a long time. They could dig and dig back also the same symbolism. Think about the crescent that was as early as the Sumerians, used in a military religious sense. The Romans will take it, the Byzantines will take it, the Muslims more famously, like in contemporary times, we would attribute the crescent to but we explained that the symbol of the crescent, the metaphysical meaning of the woman, the same Virgin Mary stands over the crescent because it symbolizes the victory of her own divine transfiguration by God, of her own telluric feminine nature, right? And she crushes the serpents as well, that during the Turkish wars became also a symbol of the Ottomans. There are some paintings of the Battle of Lepanto where you see the Virgin from heaven that drops, that are supposed to be rosary beads and are actual grenades painted in the art. It's fantastic, but for telling you how recent it is, it's just a few hundred years ago. The Asiatic Diadochoi subjects undertook to defend and support them, even at the cost of their own lives, to have always the same friends and the same enemies as them. They devoted to them not only their actions and their words, but even their thoughts. This is the interesting conception of it all. It's bending your own mind in the opposite direction of sin. We've seen, by the way, one of my oldest videos was about the Seleucid military colonies, right? And how different peoples were essentially elevated through military service. There were mostly initially Macedons that, however, also married into the local women. They were talking essentially the Syrians, the Mesopotamians, the Persians, right? And there was this mystical body that essentially the Clerici really were, and that elevated. We've seen also in part for Egypt, as a matter of fact. There were also Westerners from other countries there. We've seen, like, in Egypt, there were Celts as mercenaries, but there were even Italic military colonists way before, like, the Romans came around. So it's quite interesting because it shows you how truly imperial and Catholic, so truly universal, this tradition was, right? And the idea of a divinized ruler that in life was truly manifesting the Magus' power by delegation. It's incredibly strong among these peoples. Because imagine you're a Macedonian military colonist, you really are part of the master race there. I mean, even when the Romans took over, they ruled over the Greeks, but the Greeks lorded over these other Levantine populations. And you're surrounded by people who fear you. You can see this power manifesting as you advance across their lands. And this military colonist's duty was a total abandonment of their personality in favor of these monarchs equated to the gods, because they were the true media of divinity, and therefore the sacred militia had to simply obey as a limb of theirs, right? And it's from here that we can document it. This is just because we can document it, right? This was present all over the West, among the Celts, the Germans, the Italics, etc. There was a sacred militia, the Vers Sacrum. Look at the devotion to Mars in the Lapis Satricanum, the Mamertines. There's so much explicit evidence about this that we can barely document in the West in more archaic times, but already in the Hellenistic era for the Macedons in the East. And that's where, in fact, all this set of ideas is documentable from quite a long time. So that you see how much this sounds like a crusading ideology already at the time. I also explained a bit the transition from the lictorian axe to the Christian cross in symbolism, what that means, like this shift towards the higher level. Naturally, there are similar symbolism in the entire. They get easily overlapping. Also in the Tivats, in the runes, it's all there, right? Odin hanging himself to acquire higher knowledge. It's all part of the same identical. And I don't understand how is it even possible to deny this stuff or to accuse this being of this is just a Christian lens of learning. It's literally explicit in the genetic logic of Indo-European language, phonetically speaking. Like, if you don't understand this and you still spend your life without not knowing this, what are you even doing? So the sacred militia of the mysteries is merely the civic morality considered from the religious point of view, right? Loyalty then merged with piety, and what you see in the Middle Ages is not some sort of meek way of, to ask a Templar or a Knight of Santiago or a Teutonic Knight how meek they were, right? You don't want to even know what happened in the Baltic in detail, right? In any case, the Crusades also stand out for the distinctive way in which they realize universality and supranationality. We were just pointing it out for this ecumenic empire, precisely through the asceticism of action. There is a transfiguration. Everybody comes from a different background. These orders are open to all Latin Christians. They all speak a shared language that also resonates, as we've seen, with their enemies and beyond. The code of chivalry is not merely an idealistic fiction. It's actually something much more deeply etched into these people's mindset and lifestyles than is commonly credited. I can't stress enough, because I partly researched this topic as far as properly the different level of documentation between, of course, like the ecclesiastical and the knightly world in the Middle Ages. There are some moments in which things superimpose. You find occasionally even some knight that is actually very literate and prolific in that sense. And there, certain things emerge that are fantastic. And we will get that, especially in the series about the Battle of Markfeld. I'm reading my 300 pages master thesis back in the day, written on the basis of a very beautiful work that is the one of Ottokar Austergal, as one of the cases of at least a member of a knightly family that heard all the stories of those wars, and that, however, since he was sort of physically weak, could not fight himself, but had developed this enormous poetic sensitivity in telling essentially what the same knights would believe, which is normally, in fact, not much idealized per se, because that's where we get wrong. But most of the times I'll explain now why. But rather, probably a completely different paradigm, meaning that knights did actually have a code of chivalry, and that was true as much as it was true, like the more practical way to word that they all shared. For example, the idea that a flank attack would be ignominious because you're not facing the enemy frontally and whatever. There is also all a strategic and sort of moral consideration about this in the politics and society of the time. I will not digress on this. I have still to write an article to publish about flank attacks in the more or less like 13th, 14th century warfare, particular region. But for saying how many avenues you can take just from a topic like this. We know, I also made a video, for example, a video about Pictish cavalry that also refers mostly to what we know about the nobility through actually Gaelic sources, because it's not like we know too much about the Picts, but it was all basically the same, like playing certain games, knowing certain tricks, next to brutal psychophysical training, religious indoctrination, we were all part of this system. And it was not random, right? In those books, it's taken at random, as empty, as sort of, well, this is just a thing you do and then it works. Nobody tells you, look, this is exactly what they believed in. And that has a higher value for everything you do in life. This is the point. And this is why princes and lords from every corner converge in a single sacred undertaking, such as the Crusade, transcending personal interests and political divisions. You want to appreciate that people that had been fighting against one another, that still hated each other, admittedly, would fight side by side at some point, thereby manifesting a European solidarity, a truly traditional imperial unity that mirrored the ecumenic ideal of the Holy Roman Empire and the Ghibelline tradition. The driving force of the Crusades, moreover, came from chivalry. That is a specific term. It's not quite just tradition, but it has a lot to do with sort of its enactment. This was an institution already sort of noted in our videos. I referenced to many videos of myself in this one, such as the one about the Translatio Imperii in the Chanson de Geste, where we point out the supranational, as well as supernatural, obviously, character of chivalry. It was transcendental, that united, that was truly, speaking of empire, universal empire. So what rules over every country and every nation? The lesser people today hysterically try to instead to secede from everything, because they're inherently inferior as all isolationistic cultures that get routinely conquered throughout history. At the time, members had no fixed patria, because the world was considered just something that doesn't really quite belong to you in the moment, and that you're destined to pass across, right? To pass. And for this reason, they went wherever they could fight for the principles to which they had sworn unconditional allegiance. This is, by the way, the principle of the errant knight, and you find this stuff all over the prior Middle Ages and antiquity. What do you think that, I don't know, the Indo-European conquerors really were back in the day from the steppes? What do you think that, I don't know, the Sarmatian knights in Roman times were about? Again, but the same on a smaller basis, the Gaelic Fiannas, the Germanic Comitatus, the Italic Versacrum. What do you think they actually were? What do you think that, I don't know, the Vikings were in practice, or the Norman mercenaries in the Byzantine Empire and Eastern frontiers? Right? As far as we're concerned, I'm pretty sure many of them arrived to China and served there. We know that the Alans, for example, served as imperial bodyguards still by the time of the King Gizid dynasty of the Yuan, of the Mongol Chinese rulers, right? So it's that long, it's that constitutive, it's that fundamental to European identity. Pope Urban II, who reigned on the throne of Peter from 1088 to 1099, addressed this chivalric body precisely as the community of those who, quote, hasten wherever a war breaks out to bring there the terror of their arms in defense of honor and justice. There's a beautiful passage from Parsifal that states, like, when the mother answers the question of Parsifal, her son, regarding those knights that he saw passing in the forest, that he didn't know. He thought they were angels. And the mother says those are angels that kill everything they touch. Right? He will actually join them, and his mother will die, because that's the principle of the overprotective mother that dies in front of absolute power, of naturally paternal nature from Godfather. And so you see here how the brutality of the struggle is bent to as a mean to an end for the honor and justice on earth from God. Right? So this is incredibly beautiful, as becoming media of God through imperial manifestation. All the more reason these men were compelled to answer the call to holy war. They couldn't but be rewarded. They couldn't but be augmented in their power. A truly Augustan enterprise. Remember, the laurel, like the one of the saints, the aura, being the proof of their transfiguration in heaven. And in this regard, too, an alignment appears between the outer and inner dimension. The holy war afforded the individual experience of action rendered impersonal and de-individualized. This was part of a much bigger power that is, in fact, transcendent. It's not in the sense, when you say it's not physical, it's not because it's merely spiritual. Or depend what you mean by spiritual, because transfiguration is the one in the flesh as well. So probably the higher nature, the divine, is something else entirely. It's the hyper, it's the only true existence. Our own, as sinners, is not real existence. It's something of deterior metaphysical essence, and that continuously longs for something that has a spiraling down, but you can spiral up through this activity. At the same time, the resulting coalition of warriors in a cause superior to race, national interests, territorial attachments, and political splits gave external form to the transcendence of the particular, transcendence already inherent the ideal of the Holy Roman Empire. Right? In there, you have Romanity as the metaphysical ethnicity of any emperor. The Romans had already achieved the Golden Age with Augustus. In a Christian perspective, that's where Christ had been born, the new Apollo, sung also by Virgil, and in that sense spotted by Christian authors. This is a supranational power. You cannot achieve anything if you're not bigger and more powerful. All right, and inherently, if you can move that power, it's because you are superior, because you have greater force, because the compactness of that force is the highest. If you think that you have compactly powerful just to remain in a corner of the world, so that sort of nothing changes in your view, you don't understand that the only thing that never changes is God, and that whatever happens in the human world is eternally degenerating. It doesn't matter how you keep the fiction that this is the only thing you have to do. Right, to hysterically sort of remain secluded from all the rest, as if that didn't simply mean to give up the initiative to whomever and for you to collapse as an inferior people. Right? That's absolutely the entire point of tradition. If you don't understand this, if you don't understand what the empire is, what universal authority is, why there is a papacy in a church in the history of mankind and of the West in particular, where you had the same priestly power before, in the same Roman ethnicity that at that point matched with one of the leaders of the world, and that passed straight to the Holy Roman Empire, was dissolved barely 200 years ago, and you have no idea why that even existed, what Catholicism means, and you've just bought into post-traditional disgregationism, because that's fundamentally what most sort of quote-unquote alleged conservatism, whatever that means. There's only tradition, right? So let's not even talk about left, obviously, because that's an abomination of the dignity of mankind. But it's of humanity, I would say, because mankind is already the elevated one. But even humans, that literally means dirty, are insulted by communism. Well, that is the way. There's only one way, and the lower you fall, the more fractured you will be, always. Right? And the medievals, by the way, had learned a lesson from the bigger world empire that had not been able to hold back in the day. Right? And so you can't help but see the Crusades as this major flourishing that coincides, in fact, with the booming of Western civilization at all levels and the overtaking of the entire surroundings. This universality through action is what we described in Romanity. The sacralization of the establishment, in the incarnation of divine power on earth through the Augusti and their gaining. We'll make a video soon about that, but probably the Numen as sort of more ancestrally primitive, but that sense accurate sense of a frighteningly devastating power that can take over the world and surpass, in that sense, any kind of particularism among the Greeks that defeated the truly Catholic empire of the era, just to take their place a few centuries later with Alexander, that constituted a much more sort of metaphysically highly manifesting one, that the same Romans would follow in sort of Alexander's footsteps. Like, this is incredibly relevant. If you don't get how Augustus, he was not yet Augustus, it was still Octavian, but during his visit in Egypt, after having defeated Antony and Cleopatra, brought to his visiting of Alexander's tomb that he literally and explicitly deemed to be alive. He had achieved eternal life, right? Differently from the other co-rulers, according to Augustus. Augustus will set the standard from any political rule in the history of mankind thereafter. Now, this dynamic correspondence reflects what, from the traditional standpoint, constituted the unity of Hellas in the Delphic Amphictyony, that, as we've seen in the videos about probably the slaughtering of Python, in the ritual slaughtering of Python requires that kind of sacrifice and bloodshed at the foundation of the center of the world, given that we were talking about the sacred citadels, thing about Delphi, and again, its value for the Dorians as probably the root of Hellenic civilization. This is incredibly important, as the Olympus, by the way, this is the Asgard and so on. So if one does not understand this in its plenitude, it's a bit difficult to understand the Western civilization as well, what we actually are. And so we discussed lots of different things today. And as you understand, you need a certain capacity of abstraction in order to approach these topics. But in the final analysis, while essentially universality anchored in the asceticism of pure spiritual authority constitutes the necessary condition for a traditional unity of invisible character that we can thus transpose throughout all these different times and places, one that exists above all political fragmentation within a single civilization imprinted by the cosmic and the eternal, in the face of which all human passions and inclinations vanish, exhibiting in the spiritual sphere the same purity and power of the great forces of nature. Well, when this is joined with universality through action, the supreme ideal of the empire is realized. In other words, it's the surpassing of same humanity that holy war entails, in the attainment of divinity, thus of eternal life, an empire that is the universe entire, in whose unity is at once in turn visible and invisible, material, political, as well as spiritual. This is the lens through which you should look at historical events, how much of this moral hegemony is able to hold. And that's why people today do not understand absolutely anything, nor about war, nor about politics, nor what happens. Because if you look, again, at all, like from the comments that obviously I don't publish about those who would like the war in Ukraine to be the opposite of what it is, you understand that these people do not have any interest whatsoever in attaining power. They're just, with vile resentment, trying to carve out a fantasy reality where their own anger, their own sense of cultural inferiority, the fact that, allegedly, like, the second power in the world was brutally humiliated in all its incompetence and embarrassing, weakness, inferiority, and, moral putrescence, is they, as lesser people, what they cannot afford, because it speaks of themselves in their dissolution as less than mankind, right? And this is exactly the point of it all. And that's why the empire is the only way to victory. Because until they will be crushed, we will not obtain a purity of soul. And that's why holy war is necessary and sacrifices and bloodshed is necessary. This is what the entire imperial Catholic tradition is solely resting on. And so when lesser people, for example, are incapable of seeing why, for example, Europe as a cluster of powers is superior to its opponents, nobody can dislodge that. They are essentially denying the same agglutination process that happens throughout every imperial achievement. And they will only want to take refuge in their localistic piece of dirt, of humus, of chthonic telluric waste, because they're essentially what they are themselves in a purely metaphysical sense. Right? Heroic asceticism itself, the indomitable warrior vocation, intensified by supernatural direction, functions as the precise instrument for this accomplishment, so that in the outer domain, in the higher nature, the organized body of many peoples brought together and unified by one great conquering lineage, the same unity of the inner realm may find its analogical reflection. No higher power, no greater power. Only God matters. All the rest doesn't. Only God is. All the rest isn't. This is the message that many crusaders died preferring, coming from their hearts, right? And this is why they earned their place in heaven. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.